It was a crisp November evening, and Sarah was driving home from her late shift at the local bakery. The days were getting shorter, and darkness had already enveloped the countryside. She was taking her usual route, Cedar Lane, a narrow, winding road that cut through the dense forest. It was a path she had driven countless times before, but tonight, something felt off. The trees cast long, eerie shadows across the road, and a thick fog began to roll in, making visibility difficult. Sarah turned on her high beams, but the fog seemed to swallow the light. As she rounded a bend, she noticed flashing red and blue lights up ahead. A police cruiser was parked on the side of the road, and an officer was waving her down. "You'll need to take the detour," the officer said, his voice calm but firm. His face was partially obscured by the beam of his flashlight. "There's been an accident up ahead. Take that path." He pointed to a narrow dirt road that branched off from Cedar Lane. Sarah hesitated. The detour looked barely passable, overgrown with weeds and hardly wide enough for her car. But the officer's expression was unreadable, and she didn't want to argue. She nodded, turned onto the dirt path, and slowly crept forward. The further she went, the more oppressive the forest became. The trees seemed to close in around her, their gnarled branches forming a tangled canopy overhead. The fog grew thicker, swirling like ghostly fingers around her car. After what felt like an eternity, Sarah realized the path wasn't leading anywhere. Her GPS had lost signal, and her phone displayed the dreaded "no service" message. Panic began to set in. She decided to turn around, but when she looked back, the path had disappeared. Behind her was nothing but an impenetrable wall of trees. Her chest tightened with fear. She turned the wheel and tried to move forward, hoping to find another way out. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the middle of the path. Sarah slammed on the brakes, her heart pounding. It was the same officer she'd seen earlier, standing motionless in the fog. She rolled down the window to ask for directions, but he simply stared at her, his eyes dark and empty. Before she could say anything, the officer vanished into thin air. Sarah's blood ran cold. She hit the gas, desperate to escape. The trees and fog blurred together as she sped through the forest. Just as she thought she was lost for good, the path opened up into a clearing. Relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. In the center of the clearing was another police cruiser, identical to the first. The driver's door was open, and the interior light cast an eerie glow. Sarah stepped out of her car, drawn by a morbid curiosity. As she approached, she saw that the inside of the cruiser was smeared with dark, rust-colored stains. Blood. Her breath hitched, and she stumbled back, nearly tripping over a tree root. She noticed a note pinned to the steering wheel with a knife. The paper was yellowed and frayed, as if it had been there for years. Scrawled in shaky handwriting were the words, "Turn back now." Terrified, Sarah sprinted back to her car and floored it. The clearing vanished behind her, swallowed by the fog and shadows. She drove blindly until the trees began to thin, and the fog started to lift. Finally, she emerged onto a familiar stretch of Cedar Lane, her heart still racing. Sarah didn't go home that night. She drove to the nearest town and parked in a well-lit gas station, too shaken to move until sunrise. The next day, she told her story to the local police, but they found no trace of the cruisers or the officer. To this day, Sarah avoids Cedar Lane, haunted by the memory of that eerie detour and the warning note she discovered. It was a quiet night at the Ridgewood security office, the kind where time seemed to crawl. and every noise made you jump. Daniel had been a night watchman for over a decade, patrolling the industrial park on the outskirts of town. Most nights were uneventful, with only the occasional break-in or trespasser. But this night was different. This night, he would learn to heed the warnings of those who came before him. The call came in around midnight, a crackling over the radio that made Daniel sit up straight. "Dispatch to Unit 6. We have a report of suspicious activity at the old Miller warehouse. Please investigate." Daniel acknowledged the call and grabbed his flashlight. The Miller warehouse had been abandoned for years, its once bustling factory now a decaying shell. As he approached the building, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Something didn't feel right. He entered the warehouse, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air was thick with dust, and the silence was oppressive. As he moved deeper into the building, he heard faint whispers like echoes from another time. "Is anyone there?" Daniel called out, his voice echoing off the walls. There was no response, just the eerie whispers growing louder. He followed the sound to the back of the warehouse, where he found an old office door slightly ajar. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was empty, except for a single wooden chair in the center. On the chair sat a dusty, leather-bound book. Daniel approached cautiously and picked up the book. As he opened it, a chill ran down his spine. The pages were filled with handwritten entries, each one a warning from previous night watchmen. "Beware the night watcher," one entry read. "He appears at midnight, a ghostly figure with eyes that burn like embers. Those who see him are never the same." Daniel felt a cold draft and turned to see a shadowy figure standing in the doorway. The figure's eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and Daniel's blood ran cold. He tried to move, but his feet felt like they were glued to the floor. The night watcher stepped forward, his gaze piercing through Daniel. "You have been warned," the figure said in a voice that sounded like the rustling of dead leaves. "Leave this place and never return." Daniel dropped the book and fled the warehouse, not stopping until he reached his car. His heart was pounding, and his mind raced with the warnings he had read. He reported the incident to his supervisor, but they found no trace of the figure or the book. Daniel's supervisor, Frank, was a grizzled veteran of the security business, with years of experience and a healthy dose of skepticism. When Daniel recounted his experience, Frank furrowed his brow and scratched his chin. "Ghost stories." "In the Miller warehouse," Frank muttered, shaking his head. "I've heard some strange things in my time, but this takes the cake. Are you sure you weren't just seeing things, Dan?" Daniel's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "I swear, Frank, I saw him, the night watcher, and the book. It was filled with warnings from other watchmen. I'm not making this up." Frank sighed, leaning back in his chair. All right. I'll check it out myself, but you get some rest. You look like you've seen a ghost." Daniel didn't argue. He left the office and headed home, his mind still reeling from the night's events. He couldn't shake the image of the night watcher's glowing eyes, or the eerie feeling that had settled over him. Sleep was elusive that night, his dreams filled with shadows and whispers. The next day, Frank made his way to the Miller warehouse, determined to get to the bottom of Daniel's story. As he entered the building, he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The warehouse was just as Daniel had described, dark, dusty, and oppressively silent. Frank moved through the building, his flashlight sweeping over the decaying walls and discarded machinery. He found the office door ajar, just as Daniel had said. Pushing it open, he stepped inside and saw the wooden chair in the center of the room. but the book was nowhere to be found. Must have been a trick of the light, Frank muttered to himself. He turned to leave, but a chill ran down his spine as he felt a cold draft pass through the room. He spun around, and there, in the doorway, stood the Night Watcher. Frank's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the figure, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The Night Watcher stepped forward, its voice a whisper that echoed through the room. "You have been warned. Leave this place and never return." Frank felt a surge of fear, but he forced himself to stand his ground. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice trembling. "What do you want?" The Night Watcher tilted its head, the glow in its eyes intensifying. "I am the guardian of this place. Those who intrude are not welcome. Leave or face the consequences." Frank backed away, his heart pounding. He stumbled out of the office and fled the warehouse, not stopping until he was safely outside. He leaned against his car, trying to catch his breath, his mind racing with what he had just witnessed. Back at the security office, Frank called Daniel and told him what had happened. "You were right, Dan. I saw him too. The Night Watcher. We need to stay away from that place. It's not safe." Daniel felt a mix of relief and dread. He had been vindicated, but the confirmation of the Night Watcher's existence only heightened his fear. He knew he couldn't continue working as a night watchman, not with the knowledge of what lurked in the shadows. A few weeks later, Daniel decided to leave Ridgewood and start anew. He couldn't escape the feeling that the Night Watcher was still watching him, lurking in the dark corners of his mind. He packed his belongings and moved to a small town far away from the industrial park and its haunted warehouse. But even in his new home, Daniel couldn't shake the memories of that fateful night. He found himself drawn to old books and local legends, trying to understand the nature of the Night Watcher and its connection to the Miller warehouse. One evening, while browsing a dusty used bookstore, Daniel stumbled upon a worn, leather-bound journal. The cover was cracked, and the pages yellowed with age. As he flipped through it, his heart raced. The journal was filled with entries from various night watchmen, all recounting encounters with the Night Watcher and other supernatural entities. Daniel spent hours reading the entries, each one more chilling than the last. He learned that the Night Watcher was not just a ghost, but a guardian of cursed places, protecting them from trespassers and those who sought to uncover their dark secrets. One entry caught his eye, written by a man named Thomas who had worked as a night watchman in the 1950s. "The Night Watcher is relentless," Thomas had written. "Those who see him are marked, forever connected to the places he guards. There is no escape." Daniel's hands trembled as he closed the journal. He knew that he couldn't run from his past forever. The Night Watcher had marked him, and he needed to find a way to break the connection. Determined to uncover the truth, Daniel began researching the history of the Miller warehouse and the surrounding area. He discovered that the land had once been home to a small settlement in the early 1800s, which had mysteriously vanished. The settlers' disappearance had been blamed on a series of bizarre accidents and sightings of ghostly figures in the woods. As Daniel dug deeper, he found records of similar disappearances and hauntings throughout the region. It seemed that the Night Watcher had been guarding the area for centuries, ensuring that its secrets remained hidden. One night, as Daniel pored over old maps and documents, he came across a reference to a hidden chamber beneath the Miller warehouse. The chamber was said to contain artifacts and relics from the lost settlement, along with a powerful talisman that could break the Night Watcher's curse. Determined to end his torment, Daniel decided to return to Ridgewood and confront the Night Watcher once and for all. He knew it was a dangerous gamble, but he couldn't live in fear any longer. Under the cover of darkness, Daniel made his way back to the Miller warehouse. The building loomed ominously in the moonlight, its decaying walls casting long shadows. He took a deep breath and stepped inside, the memories of his previous encounter flooding back. Moving cautiously through the warehouse, Daniel found the old office door and pushed it open. The wooden chair still sat in the center of the room, but the book was gone. He scanned the room, searching for any signs of the hidden chamber. After what felt like an eternity, he discovered a loose floorboard in the corner of the room. He pried it up, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. With his heart pounding, Daniel grabbed his flashlight and began to descend. The air grew colder as he went deeper, and the faint whispers returned, echoing off the damp walls. At the bottom of the staircase, he found a small chamber filled with ancient artifacts and relics. In the center of the room, on a stone pedestal, lay the talisman, a small, intricately carved amulet that seemed to pulse with a faint, eerie light. As Daniel reached for the talisman, a familiar chill ran down his spine. He turned to see the Night Watcher standing at the entrance to the chamber, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The figure moved slowly towards him, its presence filling the small space with an oppressive dread. Daniel's hands trembled as he clutched the talisman, feeling its cold surface beneath his fingers. The Night Watcher spoke, its voice a haunting whisper that seemed to come from all around him. "You were warned to leave. You should not have returned." Summoning all his courage, Daniel held the talisman up, its faint light casting eerie shadows on the walls. "I need to break the curse," he said, his voice wavering. "I need to be free from this place and from you." The Night Watcher paused, its glowing eyes narrowing as it regarded the talisman. "The curse cannot be broken," it said, its voice tinged with an ancient sorrow. "It can only be passed on." Daniel's heart sank at the words. He had hoped the talisman would be his salvation, but it seemed his fate was sealed. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "If the curse must be passed on, then let it end with me," he declared. "I will not let anyone else suffer." The Night Watcher tilted its head, the glow in its eyes flickering. "You would sacrifice yourself to end the curse. A noble choice, but a difficult one. Are you certain of your decision?" Daniel nodded, his resolve firm. "Yes, I am. This curse ends here, with me." The Night Watcher extended a shadowy hand towards the talisman, its cold touch sending a shiver through Daniel's body. "Very well. The curse will be bound to you, and you alone. But know this, your sacrifice will be eternal. You will remain as the guardian of this place, forever ensuring its secrets are kept." Daniel felt a wave of acceptance wash over him as the talisman began to glow brighter, its light enveloping both him and the Night Watcher. The chamber seemed to dissolve into a swirl of shadows and light, and Daniel's consciousness faded into darkness. When Daniel awoke, he found himself standing at the entrance to the Miller warehouse, the talisman still clutched in his hand. The Night Watcher was gone, and the oppressive feeling that had hung over the building seemed to have lifted. But Daniel knew that the curse was now his to bear. He took one last look at the warehouse, the place that had changed his life forever. With a heavy heart, he turned and walked away, knowing that he could never truly leave. The curse was now a part of him, and he would remain connected to the haunted land for all eternity. As the years passed, stories of the Night Watcher and the cursed warehouse became local legends, whispered among the townsfolk of Ridgewood. They spoke of a brave night watchman who had sacrificed himself to end the curse, and of the mysterious figure who still guarded the land. Daniel's fate was sealed, but his sacrifice ensured that no one else would suffer the same torment. He had become the guardian, the protector of the secrets buried in the shadows, and though his existence was bound to the haunted land, he found solace in knowing that he had made a difference. It started as a quiet Thursday evening in late October. I was driving home after a long day at work, the kind of day that leaves your mind hazy and your body heavy. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of deep orange and purple. My usual route, Pine Grove Road, stretched ahead of me, a narrow, poorly lit road flanked by dense woods on either side. I'd driven this road 100 times before, but that night something felt different. The shadows seemed deeper, the woods more oppressive. A faint mist crept along the asphalt, curling and twisting like ghostly fingers. Halfway down the road, I noticed flashing red and blue lights up ahead. A police cruiser was parked on the shoulder, its headlights cutting through the mist. A uniformed officer stood next to it, waving a flashlight in slow arcs. I slowed my car and rolled down the window as I approached. "You'll need to take the detour," the officer said, his voice calm but firm. His face was partially obscured by the beam of his flashlight, but his badge glinted faintly in the light. "What's going on?" I asked. "Routine investigation," he replied curtly, motioning toward a narrow dirt path that branched off from the main road. "Take that path. It'll lead you back to the highway." I hesitated. The detour looked like it hadn't seen a car in years, overgrown with weeds and barely wide enough for my sedan. But the officer's expression was unreadable, and I didn't feel like arguing. I nodded, turned onto the dirt path, and crept forward. The deeper I went, the darker it became. My headlights barely pierced the dense foliage pressing in on either side. I turned on my high beams, but it didn't help much. The mist grew thicker, swirling in the light like smoke. After about 15 minutes of slow, nerve-wracking driving, I realized something was wrong. The path didn't seem to be leading anywhere. It just kept twisting and turning deeper into the woods. My GPS had lost signal minutes ago, and my phone displayed the dreaded no-service message. Anxiety began to creep in. I glanced in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see the police cruiser following me, but the road behind me was empty. I decided to turn around, but when I shifted into reverse and looked back, the path was gone. It wasn't just obscured by darkness or mist, it had completely disappeared. Behind me was nothing but an impenetrable wall of trees. My chest tightened. I was sure I'd just come from that direction. I turned the wheel and tried to drive forward instead, hoping to find another way out. The trees seemed to close in tighter, their gnarled branches arching over the path like skeletal hands. The mist grew thicker, now so dense that I could barely see the road. And then I saw a figure standing in the middle of the path. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding. It was the same officer I'd seen earlier. He stood motionless, his flashlight dangling at his side, his face shrouded in shadows. "How did you?" I began, but my voice faltered. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there staring, or at least I think he was staring. I couldn't see his eyes, but I felt his gaze, cold and heavy, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I reached for my phone, desperate to call for help, but there was still no signal. When I looked back up, the officer was gone. The road ahead was empty. I didn't think I just hit the gas and drove faster than I should have on such a narrow path. The mist whipped past my windows, and the trees seemed to blur together in a tangle of shadows. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and my breath came in shallow gasps. Suddenly, the path opened up into a clearing. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. In the center of the clearing was a second police cruiser, identical to the first. The driver's door hung open, and the interior lights cast an eerie glow. I stopped the car and hesitated. Part of me wanted to keep driving, to plow through the clearing and pray I'd find the highway on the other side. But something about the cruiser drew me in, a morbid curiosity I couldn't shake. I stepped out of my car, the crisp autumn air biting at my skin. The silence was deafening, broken only by the crunch of leaves under my feet. As I approached the cruiser, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. The driver's seat was empty, but the interior was smeared with dark, rust-colored stains blood. A lot of it. My breath hitched, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a tree root. That's when I saw the note. It was pinned to the steering wheel with a knife, the blade driven deep into the leather. The paper was yellowed and frayed, as if it had been there for years. Scrawled in shaky handwriting were the words, "Don't trust them." I didn't wait to find out who them was. I sprinted back to my car, jumped in, and floored it. The clearing vanished behind me, swallowed by the mist and shadows. I drove blindly, my heart hammering in my chest, until the trees began to thin and the mist started to lift. Finally, the dirt path spilled out onto the main road. I recognized it immediately. It was Pine Grove Road, the same stretch I'd been driving on before the detour. There was no sign of the police cruiser, the officer, or the clearing. I didn't go home that night. I drove straight to the nearest town, parked in a well-lit gas station, and stayed there until sunrise. When I finally worked up the nerve to tell someone what had happened, I went to the local police station. The officer behind the desk listened to my story with a skeptical frown. When I mentioned the badge number I'd seen on the first officer's uniform, his expression shifted. "That badge belonged to Officer Grant," he said slowly. "But he's been dead for 10 years. Disappeared during a routine patrol on Pine Grove Road. We found his cruiser abandoned in the woods, blood stains inside, but no body." I left the station in a daze, my mind racing. To this day, I don't know what I encountered that night. Was it a ghost? A warning? Something else entirely? I've never driven down Pine Grove Road again, and I never will. Some roads are better left untraveled.